Good evening, everyone. Welcome to one of our amazing series of events put together by this fabulous panel who will introduce themselves and each other. I am Manoj Pardasani. I'm the Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Hunter College, and it is our honor and privilege to welcome all of you and this distinguished panel. Also in the audience, we want to thank and honor our distinguished lecturer, faculty, scholar, Congresswoman Maloney, who's here with us and is a vital part of Roosevelt House. So thank you for being here as well. These are strange times that we're living in, could be an understatement. At Hunter College, we are proud of our immigrant history. We stand tall with all those who have come before us, immigrants themselves and children of immigrants that have come through the doors of Hunter, both our campus schools, but especially our colleges. We are proud of our faculty members, our staff, our alums, and our current students. And we're proud to say that we live up to our mission every day. Mihi cura futuri, the care of the future is ours. And we try to live up to that mission. And so when our faculty are engaged in scholarship or service related to immigration, when they're teaching about immigration, when our students are engaged as interns or as students in studies related to immigration, we are truly proud that we're educating the next generation of thought leaders, of community leaders, hopefully those who will change the minds of some of us today that have different ways of thinking about immigrants and immigration. Hopefully. As I was planning to, and I won't speak very long, I just wanted to share with you one thing. In some of the, I was looking through things yesterday, and I came across a quote from our first president, George Washington, and he said, "I had always hoped that this land might become a safe and agreeable asylum to the virtuous and persecuted part of mankind, to whatever nation they might belong." And I wish we could live up to those ideals and the leaders who have come after that. We are a country of immigrants, and we need to honor that heritage, stand tall with it. And today's talk is a small step in highlighting the immense contributions of immigrants and organizations, highlighting the contributions of immigrants like the Tenement Museum. So take it away, Dr. Chin.
Thank you very much, Manoj, Provost Pardasani. First of all, I just want to welcome everybody here again, and thank you so much for coming to such an important discussion on the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship. I'll be brief too. Everyone on this panel is an expert on on immigration and the importance of President Lincoln, as well as the remaking of America after the Civil War. So hopefully this conversation will be able to shed light on our history and why birthright citizenship is so important for a multiracial America, and especially everyone's sense of belonging and acceptance here. So first of all, I want to introduce the panel. I'm Professor Margaret Chen, but in introducing the panel, you'll learn about me as well. So Harold Holzer, who is the director of the Roosevelt House, he served here for nearly 10 years now as director of the Roosevelt House at Hunter College, and today happens to be the 50th anniversary of the day he became press secretary to one of Hunter's best-known alums, Congresswoman Bella Abzug. I also want to say that one of the very first events I worked with Harold on here was to bring the film, The Chinese Exclusion Act here. And I was able to moderate a conversation between Rick Burns and Lee Shen-yu, the producers. So if you get a chance to watch the film, Mae Ngai was actually in the film. Next, I want to introduce the president of the Tenement Museum, and I go back quite a ways with her too, where we worked on an exhibit called Under One Roof, which has a recreated 1970s garment factory and tells the story of Puerto Rican, Jewish, and Chinese families who lived in the tenement. So of course, I wrote a book called Sewing Women, and the Chinese family and the garment factory was based on some of the research in that book. And Mae Ngai, I go the furthest back with. Not only were we at Columbia as graduate students, but I actually knew her before then. We were both postdocs, winning Social Science Research Council postdoc awards, and now we also serve on the board of the Tenement Museum. So welcome everybody here. And I'm gonna ask the very first question. Why did you all want to participate on a panel on the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship?
Well, on the very first day that Donald Trump took office in January, his very first act was to sign an executive order canceling birthright citizenship to children of undocumented immigrants and people who were temporary visitors to the United States, like foreign students or tourists. And I think we'll get into what's so momentous about that as we go along tonight. But I think it is important for us to understand that this was the #1 executive order that he signed when he took office. When a judge in Washington state, a federal judge, put a ban on it or put a restraining order on it, he said it was blatantly unconstitutional. So we will discuss what that means in terms of the meaning of the 14th Amendment. So that's why I wanted to be here. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here at the Roosevelt House and Hunter University, Hunter College. This is a true uptown downtown collaboration right now, and I take very seriously the kind of the stewardship, if you will, of the Tenement Museum, not just protecting the building, it's a National Historic Landmark, but really what's most important to me and so many people who work there are the stories of the people who lived there. And we feel it's important to kind of represent, not just kind of, to represent their aspirations. And if you think about the core building, the first building was built in 1863. Right in the middle of the Civil War. And it attracted German immigrants, Irish immigrants, East European Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants. And our second building was later home to Puerto Rican migrants and to Holocaust survivors and to Chinese immigrants. And for every family who came, no matter where they came from, they were coming for a better life for their children. And birthright citizenship was so important. It's so important to this concept of the American dream that you can leave the country you were in, or you can leave the area you were in, give up everything almost in so many cases to create something more for your children. That is so core to the lives and the motivations of the people who lived in our buildings, but I think also so core to what American identity is. So I wanted to kind of represent all the people whose lives we tell at the Tenement Museum and talk about how important the 14th Amendment is.
So I had a selfish reason for jumping into this because I never participate in panels. I'm always over there. I'm doing what Manoj did today. So I was excited that Margaret asked me. And I wanted to bring my historical specialty of Lincoln and the Civil War into the conversation as creating the foundational amendment, really, for the 14th and 15th Amendment in the first step of refining the American dream and ending slavery. Also because Eleanor Roosevelt made sure that the Declaration of Human Rights included the right of free passage of refugees. The United States never adopted it, but the UN did. But it's a bedrock foundational principle that we talk about here at Roosevelt House all the time. And also for the same reason that Mae was talking about, these are such fragile, frightening times, particularly from people whose citizenship status is, kind of up to the courts at this moment, and which the president has challenged. And just, I have to comment on there is fragility, whatever the amendment protection, but even before, because Manoj, for every quote you give me about George Washington embracing diversity of immigration, I can show you a quote from 1797, where he told John Adams, "Why are you letting all these foreigners in? You should have supported the Alien Act sooner than you did." So there's such inconsistency, and we need to address it.
Yeah, so we definitely need to address it. And I think what we hear a lot about birthright citizenship now, and we hear about the 14th Amendment, but I don't think many people know what it says. So this is the basic quote that that is referred to, that's referenced by our president, and anytime we think about birthright citizenship. And this is something that we can kind of take a look at and absorb. And then I'm going to ask the panel, maybe Mae or Harold, should talk about what this amendment meant, how and when it was passed, and also fold into this what Eric Foner has always said. You know, this was the time period of the second founding of our nation. You know, what does that mean too at the same time? So Mae, Harold, who wants to?
I think what Eric Foner meant by the second founding was that the Civil War resolved the biggest contradiction in the nation's original founding, which was the sin of slavery. And by emancipating the slaves, put America on a path where the creed that all men are created equal could apply to all men. We'll bracket women for the time being, because that actually wasn't in the agenda at the time. You know, so by ending slavery and by making the prospect or the principle of equality applicable to everyone in the United States, regardless of race, was truly a revolutionary move. And I think that you know, the 14th Amendment has an interesting history because it had always been assumed that persons born in the United States on American soil were American citizens. That is a holdover from the English common law, where people born on English soil were subjects of the king, right? And the American Revolution adopted that, but gave it its own flavor because we don't have a king. We haven't had a king. But it means that everybody born in the United States was a citizen, and that gave them a footing of equality. Now, the big problem was that it did not apply to enslaved persons. It also didn't apply to what they call Indians not taxed, right? Native Americans who belonged to sovereign tribes. So the 14th Amendment is important because it put into words what had been an assumption. If you're born in the United States, you are a citizen. It actually put it into words, and it extended it to the former slaves. So that was really a revolutionary measure.
I think politically it achieved something else. It achieved something of a reversal of a trend that had been developing in the years leading up to the Civil War, and that was a trend of making immigration more difficult, therefore citizenship more difficult for those who were born outside the United States. From the time the Alien Act, which I talked about a few minutes ago, was overturned by Jefferson and his Congress, up until the 1850s, and in a sense, really until the 80s, when the Supreme Court got into the act and Congress reinterpreted its power to regulate immigration, there was almost no regulation of immigration. The states were responsible for creating and enforcing local laws, and they tried some tricks to keep people out of the vicinity, including those who ran New York City and New York State. Idiots, for example, were excluded, whatever that meant. The indigent could be excluded, or $1 a head tax could be imposed to discourage the very poor from seeking opportunities here. But basically, once you were here and you registered at a landing depot like Castle Garden in Lower Manhattan, which received something like 60 or 70% of European immigrants at one point, 5 years later, you could become a voting citizen of the United States, which was not an onerous requirement. I mean, what a solution that might be to all of the entanglements and resentments of today. There were people who pushed back in the 1850s and said, no, it should be 14 years. It should be 21 years. Foreign-born naturalized citizens should not be eligible to hold public office. And there were tremendous tensions in the 1850s, really interrupted by the war, not much advanced or pushed back by the war, about the definitions and restrictions on and opportunities for citizenship. So the 14th Amendment came and reinvigorated the issue and created, as Mae said, a definition that had been absent.
Right, and if you'll notice the language, it says all persons born or naturalized,
Right.
right? Which is what Harold is talking about, naturalization going hand in hand. And a naturalized citizen and a birthright citizen are treated the same in the eyes of the law. They're not supposed to be different.
And Annie, I wanted to ask, how does this come up in the Tenement Museum?
So in the last year we opened a new exhibit called Union of Hope about a Black family that lived in the 8th Ward, what's now Soho. And we got connected to this family through a fascinating primary source, which is its own story. But we recreated their apartment in 97 Orchard Street. And I think one of the things that's so important to note, and one of the things that's so shocking to so many people, including New Yorkers who have studied history, is that free Black men were not able to vote in New York unless they had $250 worth of property. This was a law that was passed in New York State in 1821, anticipating emancipation. But so when we told the story of Joseph Moore, who was a waiter and he was a coachman, he would be living side by side with Irishmen and German men who had become naturalized, and they could go vote. But he, who was born in New Jersey, born in this country, born free, his parents were born free, he could not vote until the 15th Amendment was passed. So in a way, what's important about the 14th Amendment to note is that 14th Amendment did not deal with the issue of voting. They tried that. They were working towards that. They didn't get there. And it wasn't until the 15th Amendment was passed that he indeed was able to vote. And the whole community came out to celebrate this in a fascinating moment in history. So, when we tell these stories, then it makes us have to think about what was the difference. All these people are living in a tenement. The tenement is, everyone's living in a tenement, mostly in New York. But if you're German, if you're Irish, if you're East European Jewish, if you're Italian, you have a different situation. And if you're Chinese, if you had come before exclusion, you have a very different situation, one from another, including Black. So this thinking about these amendments are really important for us, because what we want to be able to do is not tell the story of one single group, but rather talk about New York under one roof. Who are all these people coming together, and how can we compare in order to have a better sense of what the city and country offered?
Yeah, and moving ahead now, I want to go on and talk about especially Abraham Lincoln. So I know you just wrote a new book, Harold, on Lincoln and immigrants. So what were Lincoln's views on citizenship, both for African Americans and immigrants? What was he thinking at the time?
So he was on record pretty consistently from about 1844 to the end of his life, 21 years later, as endorsing 5-year and voting rights citizenship for European immigrants. I hope you're putting Lincoln up there. No, you're not.
No.
That's okay. Oh,
No.
Well, let's leave-
Harold, yeah, go ahead.
all right. Well, let's leave well, you can leave that. Where was I? Dazzled by the slide movement. So 5-year citizenship, thank you. I would say that Lincoln was always a firm believer in German citizenship, right? He was less affectionate toward Irish immigrants. Why? Because the Irish voted Democratic. The Germans voted Republican. They were supporting him. Did Lincoln think there was fake voting going on, particularly against him? Yeah, he talked about it. There were Irishmen at the railroad station carrying carpet bags. Interesting, that was before carpetbagging became a term. We should hire detectives and check out their eligibility. So there was a lot of that going on. But although he's remembered best for his pushback against slavery in 1862 and 3, he also recommended and pushed the first American legislation aimed at, quote, encouraging immigration. And it was a huge reform. Now, it was born of expediency, same kind of expediency that might motivate people to welcome the foreign-born today. There was so much death and destruction in the early years of the Civil War that the army was depleted of manpower. There were also, as Lincoln wrote in his State of the Union message, there were not enough workers to till the land or work in factories or mines. That was very important to him. Lead mines, silver mines, gold mines. And we can talk about mining and the Asian experience, the Chinese experience. So he proposed this huge reform. And he actually proposed that the United States pay for the ocean passage of immigrants. Totally unprecedented. And it turned out a bridge too far. Even the Republican newspapers said that's too much. We'll get the dregs of Europe, we'll get the refuse, which Emma Lazarus was happy to get, but the Americans weren't then. So he was a father of immigration reform in the United States. It's very hard to counterfactually assume where Lincoln would be on birthright citizenship, which I think is the second part of the question. What he did in terms of birthright citizenship, after kind of quietly supporting the 13th Amendment, legally ending slavery, is he had surrogates proposing birthright citizenship amendments. His Attorney General, Edward Bates, who was the most conservative member of his cabinet, began responding to inquiries actually it was inquiries about a black sea captain. Did he have the right to captain a ship? And the Attorney General concluded yes, because he's a citizen by virtue of the proclamation. He had a senator from Illinois talk about citizenship. Black citizenship is a spoil of war, and we should treat it as a spoil of war. And Francis Lieber, the German-born philosopher of war, wrote a pamphlet saying we needed a series of amendments, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th. So he wrote a very influential pamphlet for the election campaign of 64 and then published formally in 65. So he had surrogates acting in his behalf. Did he ever say he was for black citizenship or birthright citizenship? No, but the terms of citizenship were easier then. But he was not on record about black citizenship.
Thanks. Mae?
I would just add that the other important factor in all this is the Dred Scott ruling of 1857, which said that no black person, free or enslaved, was or could be a citizen of the United States. So the Civil War was very much about overturning that concept, and it's not overturned legally until the 14th Amendment, although the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment certainly imply citizenship to the freed people. But it's not legislated actually until 1866, until after the war, by the Civil Rights Act. And this is where I think the amendment becomes really interesting, because the Republicans, the radical Republicans in the Congress, the Reconstruction Congress, knew that simple legislation could be overturned. So if you gave citizenship to the freed people through a congressional act, they knew that that was not really secure. So they wanted it in the Constitution. And that's why, Donald Trump says, all these other countries have gotten rid of birthright citizenship. That's true. Great Britain has dialed it back. Australia has dialed it back. A lot of the Commonwealth countries that had birthright citizenship have dialed it back. And the United States cannot do that without changing the Constitution. So in many ways, the Reconstruction Congress was prescient, and they knew that if they were going to secure the citizenship of the freed people, it had to be in the Constitution.
By the way, if the 13th and 14th had been proposed together, as some people at the time, as the radical Republicans, so-called, I hate calling them that, they were the progressive Republicans, it would have failed. It would not have won in the second term, second try.
And I think also in this context too is we have to think about also the Asian, the Chinese immigrants. If May, I don't mind if you could talk a little bit about the Chinese immigrants on the West Coast and what was also going on at that time.
Well, I think during the time of, well, at the time of the Civil War, there were probably 100,000, 150,000 Chinese on the West Coast. Most of them had come to work in the gold mines, and then they also worked on the railroad. Well, that was a little later. But so many of them actually naturalized. There was no prohibition of them becoming citizens. There was no Dred Scott, for example, that applied to Chinese. But most Chinese who came did not intend to stay in the United States. So there was a rather low rate of naturalization. Some people did naturalize, became citizens, voted in local elections. Chinese fought in the Civil War on the side of the Union. So there were Chinese who wanted to become part of this country. And after the Civil War, we have a series of nativist movements that leads to passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that became a kind of thorn in the idea of birthright citizenship, right? Because when Congress said no Chinese can come to this country, a lot of people then who were in favor of Chinese exclusion said, well, we don't want them to come to be immigrants. Why would we want them to be citizens, right? That was their, I mean, it is logical from a racist point of view, right? But it has its own logic. So they called Chinese Americans, people born in the United States to Chinese immigrant parents, they called them things like accidental citizens or pseudo-citizens, imposter citizens, not true citizens. And it was not until 1898, which is a good 20 years later, that this issue is actually settled by the Supreme Court.
I have to say, even in the early days of the Civil War, Congress passed and Lincoln signed, maybe for racist reasons, but also for political reasons. California had a northern faction and a southern faction. Their allegiance to the Union was not automatic. It was fought for. So he signed a bill. I'm going to read the name of the bill. An act to protect free white labor against competition with Chinese labor and to discourage Chinese immigration to America, commonly called the Cooley Act, which Lincoln did not know how to spell. He was a bad speller. So this was considered by some who actually said this, that this was a guarantee that there would not be a renewal of the slave trade. That was either a legitimate argument or a way to salve unconscionable racism that was pervasive in the United States.
That's right. And I think that was a big, was a use of that particular act to try to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, to gather a group of people.
This is 20 years before. It's amazing.
That's right. That's right. So, but let's backtrack a little bit to the 14th Amendment and talk about how the 14th Amendment was passed and how that changed the balance of state and federal power. Let's talk about that first, and then we'll go ahead and we'll go from there.
So obviously it establishes national power as preeminent, governing, regulating the state's ability to create their own rules. And so it's monumental for that reason alone. But Mae should talk more about this. She's the legal expert.
Well, when it says, the 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. So there's state citizenship and national citizenship. And prior to the Civil War, state citizenship was considered primary. And that's why you had a lot of the pro-slavery elements talking about states' rights, right, as one of their legal defenses of slavery. But the Civil War and the 14th Amendment establishes the primacy of the federal government and national citizenship. And that becomes really important all the way down to today in terms of the power and authority of the Constitution over the entire country.
Absolutely. And now I'm going to move a little bit to, and ask Annie, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and especially the 15th Amendment. And you've already mentioned this is so important in all of the exhibits and all of the tours at the Tenement Museum. Talk a little bit more about how the Tenement Museum, tell us how the Tenement Museum explored these amendments.
I mean, I think, as I was saying earlier, we speak mostly about the 15th Amendment on Union of Hope. And as I was saying in my introductory comments too, just that every tour that we do is in some ways about the American dream. Like, what is it why did people come? What were they sacrificing in order to come? What did they hope for their children? So there's almost like a kind of understood sense of why people came and what they were trying to do. I mean, I would also say that in reference to thinking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, we don't have a Chinese story until we get to the 1960s, and that is because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the fact that the Chinese population that was starting to grow in New York City in the 1870s was artificially cut off by this Exclusion Act. But if it's amazing to kind of think about if that Exclusion Act had not been passed, how the Chinese population would have grown, and we would have been able to we would have had a Chinese apartment to talk about in the 1890s, but we don't. So it's not until the 1960s, after the passage of the 1965 immigration law, that you start to really see an important, significant Chinese presence. The Chinese exclusion law was overturned technically in 1943 because we were allied with China and it was inconvenient to have this Exclusion Act, but because it still had to kind of adhere to the quota system that had been passed in 1924, I think it was 105 Chinese allowed into the country at a time. So I say all of this just to pause and step back and say most of our visitors have no idea about different immigration laws passed over time and how they shape who could even be here and then what their rights were, what their possibilities were. So what we do at the museum is we're introducing these laws kind of through a family story that is in some ways more accessible than just sitting down and hearing a series of laws. And that awakens people. And I think it awakens people too because they understand that if laws were passed and laws changed, then there's actually a role they might have in speaking up about laws or arguing for laws or changing them. So that's some of the different ways that both these amendments, but also immigration law in general, comes up at the Tenement Museum.
I want to.
I was going to say, Mae, this is a perfect segue because I think we also need to talk about how important it is about the Chinese and their relationship to birthright citizenship.
Well, before I do that, I want to build on what Annie said and tell a little story about Frederick Douglass. And this is about what is the relationship between the Civil War and slave emancipation and Chinese exclusion. Is there a relationship? Frederick Douglass saw that there was a relationship. In 1869, there was already agitation to exclude the Chinese. Congress doesn't pass the exclusion laws until 1882, but in 1869, Frederick Douglass went on circuit with a speech called Our Composite Nationality. And he addressed the question of Chinese exclusion directly. And he said, we have this, after the Civil War, we have this new situation. We have blacks and whites together. We are a composite nation. But there are other people coming also. And he noted that there are many Chinese coming. Some people were alarmed about it because they were coming in large numbers. And he says, let them come. Let them come in their millions if they want to come. The world is uneven. China's a poor country. We should welcome all of them. And he was completely unperturbed that there may be many Chinese coming into the United States. He said, we should embrace them. And he talked about human right, that it was a human right to move. Mobility was a human right. And he said, if you keep out one group of people, you'll end up keeping out other people, which is what happened. And so he was amazing. And he said, if he understood that the freedom that the former slaves had won had to be extended to everybody. for it to be really genuine. And he understood that. And so you can look it up, it's online, Our Composite Nationality. It's a wonderful speech. And I find it remarkable because he knocks down every stereotype, every slur that's made against the Chinese. And he said, but you know, even if they're coarse or even if they're not civilized, let them come and they'll raise themselves. They'll live amongst us and they'll raise themselves, and they should vote, they should be citizens, they should sit on juries. He goes the whole 9 yards. And so I think it's a really important story for us, and I teach this in my classes as well, because it shows that the Civil War was not just about ending slavery, it was about democracy. And democracy has to be for everybody for it to really be democracy.
And this is a much less well-known example, but when Mae talks about Frederick Douglass in this way and the way that he's articulating the importance of welcoming the Chinese, it reminded me of a lawyer whose name was Max Kohler. And Max Kohler defended, took all sorts of immigration laws, specifically laws that went against Chinese exclusion or laws to protect Chinese citizens. And in 1902, when the Geary Act was passed in 1892 to replace the original Chinese Exclusion Act, I think was 10 years, and then the Geary Act was passed. He writes a huge op-ed in the New York Times. I couldn't print it all out because it was just so huge, but he did say that, I mean, he talks about the Chinese Exclusion Act and how important it is to overturn it, because he says that they have built up the most un-American, inhuman, barbarous, oppressive system of procedure that can be encountered in any civilized land today for the treatment of fellow men. It is only because the American people have not been truly familiar with the character of this system, because the Chinese control few, if any, votes to make them a force to be reckoned with in politics. Like, he's articulating how important it is to be American. To be American, you have to defend the rights of others who are having that taken away. So I love that, just adding on to the Frederick Douglass.
Absolutely, and I think the idea of a multiracial coalition or a multiracial group of people supporting each other is like really extremely important to look back to and to look forward to having, right?
Margaret, I think you talked about the political machinations that led to the enactment of the 14th Amendment. It might be interesting to talk about that for a moment. You know, it requires 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. As Carolyn well knows, she's been trying to get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate on the ERA for 35 years, still trying. And then 3/4 of the state legislatures have to ratify. So it's an intentionally difficult, challenging process. And the 14th was not a slam dunk, even in a Congress that was dominated by Republicans after the war, with some Confederate states not yet restored to authorized to return to the legislative bodies. And it took people like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens to lead the bandwagon in Congress and editors of Republican newspapers. But the opposition was fierce. I mean, Democrats were against the 14th as strongly as they opposed the 13th Amendment. The Sons of Confederate Veterans, which has emerged as a huge political force in the Old South and was determined to limit Black rights, to do everything within their power legally, and then eventually extra legally and violently to suppress Black rights. The President of the United States was opposed to the 14th Amendment. Andrew Johnson was opposed to the Civil Rights Act, which was overridden. He was opposed to the 14th Amendment. The suffragist movement was against the 14th Amendment, right? Because it did not include, it included men, but it did not explicitly mention women, and they had a point. So it was not easy. And it took a lot of fighting and debating, and unlike the 13th, one vote though, and it got the 2/3.
That's right. And I want to move forward. I put this picture up ahead, Wong Kim Ark. So Mae, can you talk a little bit about Wong Kim Ark?
Right. So Wong Kim Ark was born in the United States. He was born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents. His parents take him back to China, which was very common practice. So he goes back and forth a few times. And when he returns to the United States in maybe 1897 or something, they don't let him in. They say he's not a citizen. And he says he is a citizen. So here we have our test case before the court. And the court rules that, and so this is after 20 years of nativist agitation against Chinese being real citizens. The court rules that the language of the 14th Amendment is plain and upheld as what they call its declarative force, right? All persons born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, subject to the jurisdiction thereof is what is now, Trump is now saying he's trying to reinterpret. What the Supreme Court was very clear what that meant was the only people not included in the citizenship were babies born to foreign diplomats who are in the United States in their consular roles, right? And so this is what we commonly call diplomatic immunity, right? Ambassadors are not subject to the jurisdiction, right, of the United States. And a child born to a soldier of a occupying army during a time of war, which obviously was not the case. There was a third category which became moot later, which was Native American people who lived in whose tribal sovereignties trumped their citizens. So in 1924, Congress declared all Native peoples born in the United States as citizens. That was just imposed upon them. But so those two categories mainly were the only exceptions to what they meant by the jurisdiction. You know, it's common sense, right? Anybody in this country, regardless of your citizenship or immigration status, is subject to the laws of the United States. It doesn't matter who you are if you get a parking ticket, right? Or if you break the law or you're sent to jail, right? People are treated the same. They're all subject to the laws of the United States. So what's interesting, though, about, I think, Wong Kim Ark is that it is now kind of being discussed, and I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit here and echo Harold in terms of the politics of the situation. People now talk about Wong Kim Ark as this kind of the sacrosanct ruling, and it is. I mean, it's good law, it's precedent. But if you think about it, in 1898, this is just 2 years after the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal was fine. And so while they could not take citizenship away from Black people, they enshrined a system where they would be second-class citizens, right? That's the term we use to talk about discrimination, Jim Crow, inferior status in society. So why would they then give citizenship to Chinese born in the United States? They had no love of Chinese people. Believe me, they didn't. But Chinese were a small population, and to them it was not worth throwing open the meaning of the 14th Amendment to kick the Chinese to the side because they were such a small population. And in their ruling in Wong Kim Ark, the court says to change the application, to say there are exceptions to the birthright citizenship, would jeopardize the citizenship of all the children of the Europeans who have been coming here for decades. That was their concern. That if you start saying, well, no, it doesn't apply to this little group here, you actually throw open the whole thing. And they did not want to do that. And I think the court was also at this time very much jealous of its authority in terms of the national law, right? So it's still not that long after the Civil War. The country is still in a process of consolidating around a national polity, a national market, right? And They want immigrants to come in to industrialize, all the people who end up living on Orchard Street, right? They want immigrants to come to build the country as it's turning into an urban and industrial country. So the stakes are very high in terms of European immigration, national consolidation, and in a way, the Chinese were not that important to them, but it's the case around which these things become settled. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and we can get some other comments. But the reason why I say this is because the Chinese exclusion laws were still in force, right? So you have a tension, right, between the Constitution recognizing birthright citizenship for Chinese born in the United States. And then you have the exclusion laws that say Chinese are not welcome here. So those two things are not, they're not consistent with each other. They're not totally contradictory, but they are a tension, and it leads to a culture and a politics where the citizenship of Chinese born in the United States is never really stable. It's precarious. It's, well, all my friends here, Asian Americans, we all know, we all have grown up saying, where are you from? Where are you really from? Because they don't think that we can be American, that we could be born here and be citizens just like the next white person, right? So it has a very deep and kind of long-lasting imprint, this idea that Chinese are always foreign, and that comes from the exclusion laws. So even though we're citizens by birth, it's suspect, right? And so I think this is the legacy we have of these two trends in the 19th century of exclusion on the one hand and birthright citizenship on the other.
Could I just add, against this backdrop of legal tension, right, interpretive tension, there's also the one legacy we haven't mentioned, and that's the legacy of the tragic legacy of violence as it is applied to address things when people become frustrated. I'm astonished, Annie, that one of your buildings dates to 1863 and may have a record of integration in the buildings, because after the draft riots of July 1st, 1863, free Black people or intermarried people generally got out from those situations and created their own communities in New York as a means of self-protection. The violence against Blacks in the South, I mean, all the way to Tulsa, which is not exactly the South, and against Chinese was horrendous. The accounts that are still being unearthed and still being withheld are part of this story. Just ignoring the constitutional amendments. I know we have to go to questions because we're running out of time.
Absolutely. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything about the more staying in New York City. But anyway, so I want to move forward now. But let's finish up this and take questions. But let's move forward to the 20th century. What is this? What does birthright citizenship, the idea of birthright citizenship, mean to us in the 20th century and now even in the 21st century?
Well, I think the problem that I talked about with the Chinese, right, that on the one hand you have exclusion, on the other hand you have citizenship, that becomes reproduced in the 20th century with Mexican Americans, right? Mexican immigrants are the largest group of undocumented immigrants after 1924's Restrictive Immigration Act, right? Because even though Mexican workers have been coming in across the border freely for decades to work in the Southwest, now they had to go through inspection and they had to have a visa. And if they didn't have those papers, they were deportable, right? So there grows this idea that all Mexicans are illegal, right? So they're not all illegal, but there is a large number of undocumented Mexican workers. Their children born in the United States are citizens, right, by the 14th Amendment. And so during the Great Depression, there were county welfare bureaus and the federal government repatriated, meaning they removed 400,000 people of Mexican descent, half of whom were citizens, right? And so this is the same pattern of where an immigration question spills over into how the citizenship of the children of the immigrants is suspect or actually nullified, right? So it's not just a cultural thing where they think that everybody's illegal, but they're actually treated as though they're illegal. And the other instance of official, what I call alien citizenship, was the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, 2/3 of whom were US citizens by birth. And it was based on, a crude statement by US Army General DeWitt: the Japanese are an enemy race, right? It didn't matter if they were citizens or not. And do we have the picture of 9066? The order to, go back one, the order to evacuate the West Coast for the internment sites calls for all persons of Japanese ancestry, aliens and non-aliens. So think about that. They can't actually say it because it's too gross, right? It's too outrageous. So they order the removal of aliens and non-aliens, right? And this was something that very few people opposed at the time, the internment. It was, even the National ACLU supported it. I think it was mostly the Quakers who opposed the internment. And it was not until the 1980s when the children of the internees led a movement for redress and reparations that finally led to an official apology and a modest reparation from the US government.
It's not every day that I have to apologize here for both Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. So they had their short-sightedness, to be sure.
Right. So I'm gonna, we're coming close to the end. So I'm gonna ask you to think of questions, but I'm gonna ask the first one. So what's the possibility of dangers of birthright citizenship now? And then I saw the first hand go up there.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know. We've been waiting breathlessly and in fear for this big test case that's going right to the Supreme Court. And I think it'll survive 5-4 or 6-3, but who knows?
Who knows? The argument is not that they want to overturn the 14th. They just want to reinterpret subject to the jurisdiction thereof to mean they want jurisdiction to mean political allegiance to the United States. And so they say that the illegal aliens were not welcome, and they do not come in friendship because they come breaking the laws. And therefore, they have not sworn allegiance to the United States. And that argument has been made. There's been bills introduced in Congress going back to the 1980s. It's always been considered a crackpot argument. The father of that theory is John Eastman, who you may remember wrote the brief that Pence could discard the electoral votes. He's the father of that idea. I was surprised that the court may hear this case very, very soon. It was not believed that this would make it to the Supreme Court quickly, but the 3 federal judges who heard the case, I think it was Maryland, Massachusetts, and Washington State, put a stop on the executive order and made it a national injunction, national. And the Trump administration is saying that they do not have jurisdiction, they do not have the authority to impose a nationwide injunction. So 22 states are covered by those judges' order. That means there's 28 states that are not. So the Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court for an emergency hearing so that they can implement the executive order in 28 states. That is not only a huge wedge into the issue, obviously, but can you imagine the chaos of women who are going to give birth? And if you're in the wrong state, it's interesting, right? Because it's both, you can get an abortion in some states and not others, and now you're going to be able to give birth to a citizen in some states and not others. So that's the thing to watch for right now.
Thank you.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. I was just curious if you guys could talk a little bit about how unique this is in terms of like the global stage. You know, I have friends that are European, and we think about immigration very differently because of where we grew up. And so birthright citizenship, you know, Exclusion Act, things like that. I'm just curious as to how unique it is to be an American, or is it more of a global thinking?
32
Can I
countries.
just say one point, a prefatory point? European citizenship rights in the United States were not automatic in the early parts of the 19th century either. So I think there's always been precarity attached to reestablishing oneself in the United States. But again, the founders had a big land to fill, and most of them encouraged resettlement here until they didn't. And in the Civil War, Lincoln didn't want Irish immigrants because they voted Democratic until he needed Irish-born soldiers to fight in the Civil War. The Army did not allow soldiers to enlist who could not speak English until they needed soldiers who spoke Chinese or German. So there are contingencies attached, but nothing has ever been assured in this long, slow, and uneven path to embracing people who want to become citizens.
You will often hear President Trump say that the United States is the only country in the world that has birthright citizenship. That's not true. 32 countries have birthright citizenship. It's the common practice in all of the Americas, and it's also the practice in the British settler countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Because they, like the United States, follow the British common law. Most of continental Europe follows the law of blood. Citizenship is determined by your father, right? So there's jus sanguinis, which is right of blood, and the right of soil, jus soli. And the British countries, the countries of the British Commonwealth and Great Britain, tweaked their citizenship laws when, after World War II, in the post-colonial era, more and more people from the former colonies migrated to those countries. So when you had large numbers of people from the Caribbean and South Asia coming to England as citizens, right, of Great Britain, right, of the Commonwealth, this became a political problem, and there was a lot of anti-immigration sentiment. So now you have to have one parent who is a British citizen in England, in Great Britain, and they have passed similar things in New Zealand and Australia. The interesting thing is that the rule of blood citizenship in Europe has gone the other way. So in Germany, for example, you have, since the 1970s, a very large population of Turkish people who came as guest workers, guest laborers, and they had no right to citizenship because they're not German descended. And so you have 3 generations of Turkish people in Germany who were denied citizenship. And so maybe within the last 10 years, they changed the laws so that if you are born in Germany to Turkish parents, you can claim German citizenship when you become at the age of majority. But you have to come forward and claim it, so it's not automatic. So they're going in the other direction, right? And we seem to be going in the opposite direction.
Wait for the mic.
I was thinking also about what Professor Ngai was talking about, the implications. And in your book, Impossible Subjects, you talk about the Japanese American detainees and how they had a kind of horrible choice to make, whether to take an oath to the United States, and then if they did that, then they might be thrown to Japan, and then the Japanese might not want them. And it did occur to me that this would, if applied, it would create stateless people.
Exactly.
Like who, you know, again, like the countries that the parents of these children came from wouldn't necessarily recognize them as citizens of their state.
No, absolutely. You would have babies born at the moment of their birth. they are stateless and deportable. Think about that. Babies, stateless and deportable.
I think we have one more question in the back.
Beyond the scope. If this is not beyond the scope, do you have any suggestions about fixing the so-called broken immigration system?
That would be, that would be a wonderful thing, that we were at a point where we could actually talk about the problem in the country. And the problem in the country is not immigrants. The problem in the country is that we have a system that is outdated and has been in need of congressional change for decades. It's been years since we've updated the system. And then that has caused so many problems all over. So, I mean, that would be a wonderful situation, to be at a point where we could actually go to Congress and have legislative change to improve the system that we have now, instead of blaming people.
You know, when Joseph Biden became president, one of the first things he did was that he announced an immigration program, and it was actually pretty good. And it was introduced into the Congress. The lead sponsor was the senator from New Jersey, who's no longer the senator. But that bill was actually pretty good because it cleared all the backlogs. It said it was based on family unification. It actually said if you were deported under Trump, you could come back. It was very interesting.
You mean Trump won? If you were deported under Trump won?
Under the first Trump administration, it was actually a very progressive bill, and it had a provision for temporary visas, which has always been controversial among immigration advocates, guest worker visas, because the problem with those is that you come and work, but the employer controls you, right? So the idea in this bill was that you could come with a temporary work visa, but you held the visa, not the employer, which means you could quit and find another job. And at the end of that visa, you had the possibility to apply for a green card. And that was a big change. So hopefully we can have another administration, another Congress, and revisit some of those ideas.
Okay, we have one last question over here. We're gonna go head upstairs, and you can.
There seems to be a premeditated effort not to achieve asylum or to get jobs, but I've heard there's an effort where they come to the country and there's a race to get pregnant so that they get citizenship for the baby, and perhaps it'll spread to the family as well. That doesn't go into jurisdiction question.
Well, that's part of the argument that the Trump administration is making about the so-called anchor babies that women come to give birth in the United States. That's actually against the law. I mean, if they want to stop that practice, they should enforce that law. They don't have to change the 14th Amendment. There's a law against, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know the name of the law. It's actually not legal to just come here and have a.
No,
Yeah, no, but we don't condone that. We have a law against it. You don't have to change the Constitution to address that problem.
Right. Okay, well, you're not being heard.
Can I say one thing I wanted to think about, just because we're at Hunter too, and I have the good fortune this semester to be teaching a Macaulay honors class on the people of New York, and by far the majority of the students are the children of immigrants. And we were just reading, so I'm in this class teaching, and we just read sections of Philip Kazanitz's book called Inheriting the City, which was written also with Mary Waters and John Mollenkopf, and I think Jennifer Holliday. But this book Kazanitz et al. Talked to the second generation and did extensive interviews. And what they found, and they started out saying, like, is this going to be a problem? Does this generation face a problem? And there are problems, but fundamentally, what he said is that there's a second generation advantage, that these students, because they have to assimilate and negotiate their own culture as well as learn about America and put that together, that adds something to the whole equation. Now, again, I'm not making a point about law right now, but I am making a point about what we think of is American and how important it is to kind of raise up these ideas that I think are so important in New York and in this university and throughout.
Thank you so much, Annie. That's a great way to end. And I think that the panelists, we're all going to stay. We're all going to go upstairs. So I invite you all to go upstairs to the reception. And you have questions, you can talk with them one-on-one. Thank you so much for coming.